Signore e signori, grazie a nome di tutta la nostra comunità per la vostra presenza qui dall'Accademia Britannica. Vi offro l'accoglienza più calorosa possibile. I couldn't be a happier man than I am to have the pleasure to introduce Professor John Osborne to deliver tonight's instalment of our Wednesday evening lecture series. John is one of the most affable and brilliant scholars that the British School at Rome has the honour to call its friend. He is currently Professor of Art History at Carleton, where he first pursued his BA and where he made it all the way to Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, taking many a distinguished detour along the way at the Courtauld, University of Virginia, University of Toronto, and Queen's University. When John was a PhD student, first brought his thoughts on the paintings in the lower church of San Clemente to the great Richard Krautheimer. Krautheimer ruthlessly interrupted young John and said, "Stop," and bundled him into a taxi, and after a silent cab ride to San Clemente, was escorted into the lower church and said, "Please continue." It was an extraordinary start to an extraordinary career, specializing in early medieval material culture in the cities of Rome and Venice. In addition to scores of articles, John's edition of Master Gregorius, The Marvels of Rome, his work with Amanda Claridge, a formidable duo, on the early Christian and medieval antiquities volumes of the Cassiano dal Pozzo Paper Museum series, his work on Santa Maria Antiqua, his contribution to a fantastic collection of essays called Rome Across Time and Space, published with Cambridge University Press in 2011, and not to forget his co-edited volume on Old St Peter's, published in 2013 with Cambridge University Press as part of the British School at Rome Studies series. All of these have made very significant and clever contributions to the field, but also characterized by how incredibly useful they are, something to which we should all aspire. Here at the BSR, we look forward eagerly each year to John's annual visit, where he adds great warmth and value to our proceedings, and where here he was also rightly recognised with an honorary fellowship in 2006. We're also very grateful to John for his advocacy of the British School at Rome in the context of the Canadian Academy. Our ties to Canada are a very important part of our mission. I know John will be delighted that we've had a string of outstanding Canadian medievalists amongst our fellowship in recent times. There could be no speaker, no location, and no time more appropriate for tonight's lecture on John Henry Parker's photographic exploration of the Roman catacombs. I have a hunch that John won't miss the opportunity to indicate the Canadian origins of Charles Smeaton. The British School at Rome has amongst its rich library and archival resources the Parker photographic collection, and we're very grateful to Valerie Scott and members of the library staff for assembling a wonderful little accompanying mostra outside in the foyer. And only last month marked the 150th anniversary of Parker's undertakings. John, thank you very much for being with us. We all look forward hugely to your magnesium wire style flashes of inspiration in the Roman catacombs. But please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Professor John Osborne.
Thank you, Tom. That's quite the introduction. Grazie a tutti qui presenti. And thank you also to Valerie and to the staff of the Library and Archives of the BSR for the lovely little exhibition outside. If you missed it coming in, please take a look outside. It has a number of the things that I will be referring to actually there in the cabinets, and I'll try to mention them as I go along. It's long been known that the first photographs of the Roman catacombs were undertaken actually by a Canadian photographer, Charles Smeaton, at the behest of the English antiquarian John Henry Parker. But little information has been available about Smeaton's origins, about his photographic processes, and about the precise circumstances which brought him to take pictures in the catacomb of Priscilla in January of 1867, as well as in other cemeteries. But as you'll see, I'm going to focus on that one occasion. And it's my intention this evening to rectify that oversight and also to share with you a remarkable and hitherto unknown account of Smeaton's visit to the Via Salaria, to the catacomb of Priscilla, precisely 150 years ago, an account which he sent back to his family in Canada. And I know there's at least one other Canadian in the room. 1867 is a very important year for Canadians, and it's the year that Canada, a series of British colonies in North America came together to united to become Canada. And we're celebrating this year our 150th anniversary, and therefore it seemed appropriate to speak also about the 150th anniversary of Smeaton's work in the catacombs. I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of historical context about how images of the catacombs came to be important. The post-medieval interest in documenting the painted decorations of the Roman catacombs may be traced to the late years of the 16th century. And of course, I probably don't need to explain that in the Middle Ages, the catacombs very slowly became abandoned, forgotten about, and by the time we get to the 1500s, very little information was available about them, and very few even were known in terms of their location. But that changed in the second half of the 16th century, in the years following the Council of Trent, and it was prompted in part by the accidental rediscovery of the catacomb of the Giordani on the Via Salaria Nova in May of 1578. But mostly it happened because this rediscovery coincided with a more general reawakening of interest in the early centuries of the Christian Church that was championed in Rome by Filippo Neri and the Roman Oratory. In the decade of the 1590s, a very intrepid group of gentil uomini curiosi, in the words of Antonio Bosio, and the group included names, some of which you may recognize from other contexts: Pompeo Ugonio, historian, Alfonso Ciaconio, Philip van Vinge, and of course Bosio himself. This group of young scholars passionate about early Christianity began a systematic process of exploring and recording the early Christian cemeteries and their painted decorations. A number of their sketchbooks are preserved today in the Biblioteca Vaticana, also in the Biblioteca Vallicelliana. And this led in turn to the first attempt at an academic study of the Roman catacombs, which was Bosio's Roma Sotterranea, published posthumously. He died in 1629, and this book has a printed date of 1632, although it actually appeared a few years after that. It was a project championed, as were many projects championed in the 1630s, by Cardinal Francesco Barberini. In this work, Bosio provides a vivid account of his first visit to the catacomb of Domitilla to the south of Rome on December the 10th of 1593, and of the sense of panic that ensued in his group when he and his companions exhausted their supply of light. And I mention this for a reason that you'll understand later. They found their way back to the surface only with difficulty. And thereafter, says Bosio, they were much more careful, taking with them a large ball of twine. They'd obviously read about the labyrinth, and a plentiful supply of candles. Now, the illustrations of the Roma Sotterranea and subsequent books on the catacombs comprised or were illustrated by engraved versions of drawings perforce made rapidly and often with exceptionally poor light. And that remained the situation for illustrating any material about the catacombs well into the middle of the 19th century, when again the academic study of the Roman catacombs was taken up by a certain Giovanni Battista de Rossi, who was really, we still regard as the founder of the discipline which came subsequently to be known as Christian archaeology. It's de Rossi you see here. The decades of the 1850s and 1860s witnessed not only the rediscovery of a number of new cemeteries, but also a reawakening of scholarly interest in their academic study and publication. And de Rossi played a role in both of those. He was active in rediscovery, he was very active in the publication, and indeed, we think of him now, we remember him mainly for the publications, his own 3-volume study, La Roma Sotterranea Christiana, published between 1864 and 1877, and of course a dedicated annual journal, the Bollettino di Archeologia Cristiana, which he launched in 1863, the forerunner of our modern Revista di Archeologia Cristiana. Now, in undertaking his research, de Rossi received the personal encouragement of Pope Pius IX, who on a famous occasion in 1854 paid a visit to the catacomb of St. Calixtus on the Via Appia in order to view the tombs of a series of early popes which de Rossi had managed to rediscover. However, not all interested parties were Roman, nor even Italian. Prominent among the English-speaking community who resided in Rome for at least part of each year was the British publisher and antiquarian John Henry Parker, whom you see here. Parker, who in 1865 co-founded the British and American Archaeological Society of Rome. And a few years thereafter, he was appointed director of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a post which he would hold till his death in 1884 at age 78. Now, Parker started to come to Rome regularly for a reason. In 1863, he had managed to contract rheumatic fever during a visit to Windsor Castle, of all places, to which he had been invited by Prince Albert in order to study the medieval architecture. Medieval castles are not good for one's health in the winter. And subsequently, his doctors advised that he should spend his winters in a milder climate. He actually tried the French Riviera the first year, but that didn't suit. I don't think there were enough academic pursuits there. He had earlier, in 1859, visited both Rome and Ravenna, and there were things in those cities that interested him. So he chose Rome, actually. And beginning with the winter of 1864-65, Parker would spend some 13 consecutive seasons here in Rome. The mid-19th century was a great age, not merely for archaeology, but also for the study of standing remains, with the aim of bringing this physical evidence to bear on the understanding of history. And Parker's particular mission was to document classical and, to a lesser extent, medieval monuments using a recently invented technique: photography. And this allowed him to create a much more accurate record of a building or an archaeological site than was hitherto possible through drawings. And it also allowed that record to be made very easily accessible to a broader public. So Parker became the great champion of photography in Rome. And he made his photographs available for sale to all and sundry, both in Rome and also back every summer in London. And in order to advertise what was on offer, he also prepared and published catalogs of his photographs, beginning in 1867 with a long title, "A Catalogue of a Series of Photographs Illustrative of the Archaeology of Rome, prepared under the direction of John Henry Parker in the winters of 1864, 65, and 66. And these would come out regularly thereafter, and you can see one in the vitrine outside. That first one contained a list of some 755 numbered photographs, which were available for purchase at a very reasonable price. In the following years, Parker would amass a collection of roughly 3,400 negatives, featuring views of the city of Rome and its monuments. And this archive would form the basis for a large scholarly project, the Archaeology of Rome, which was published in 13 volumes between 1874 and 78, and which used the photographs to illustrate the written text. And the volume that deals with the catacombs is also on display. Tragically, most of the original Parker negatives were lost in a fire in July 1893, fire which badly damaged the Palazzo della Porta Negroni Caffarelli in Via Condotti. Although some 460, which is just a tiny fraction of the original, do still survive, today divided between two Roman collections, the Istituto Centrale per il Catalogo e la Documentazione and the American Academy here in Rome. But we know of the entire collection from various sets of prints which were made from the negatives prior to 1893. And these are housed in a variety of collections. There is one, or a number here in Rome. There's one here, the British School. The American Academy has one, also the German Archaeological Institute. And there are other sets in London and in Oxford, and one at the University of Michigan in America at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology. Now, I happened to first encounter Parker when, as Tom said, I was a graduate student writing my doctoral thesis on the early medieval murals in the lower church of San Clemente. And for those who don't know, the lower church of San Clemente was rediscovered by accident, purely by accident, in an archaeological investigation undertaken between 1858 and 1869, so precisely the moment Parker was starting to do his work in Rome. Now, this was, of course, some decades before what we might think of as modern archaeology, certainly before archaeology came to be treated as a science. So, excavation records? No, none. And so for details of what was found and when and its condition, I was dependent for San Clemente on a variety of other sources. Contemporary press accounts were useful. The account books of San Clemente, which are preserved today in their archive, were very useful. Watercolor copies of the murals made by an artist by the name of William Ewing, somewhat useful, but he took some, artistic license, shall we say. There were accounts of the excavation in De Rossi's Bollettino. Those were very useful. There was an account of the excavation written by the Irish Dominican prior of San Clemente, Father Joseph Maluli, Irish Dominican. That was very useful also. But almost the most useful thing were some remarkable photographs taken for Parker, a set of which was conveniently available right here in the British School where I was living. So it was a wonderful discovery for me. And I think more generally, the Parker photographs continue to be an important source of information for not only archaeologists but also art historians regarding the nature and the condition of monuments and of mural paintings in the 1860s and early 1870s, many of which have subsequently been altered, whether deliberately by William Ewing or as we discovered from the account books, or through some act of nature or just over time, some which no longer even exist. And in some instances, the Parker photographs constitute a unique record of things which no longer survive. In my innocence and ignorance, at first I thought that Parker pulled out his handy camera and took these pictures himself, but I was wrong. Parker was not a photographer. And consequently, he needed to employ others who were. And the first to whom he gave a lot of work was a photographer by the name of Carlo Baldassare Simelli, whose photography shop was located in Via del Corso. And Simelli was a good choice by Parker because Simelli was among the first to recognize the commercial possibilities for photographic images of Rome's historical buildings and archaeological sites. And in fact, prior to working with Parker, he had collaborated with a French historian, Javier Barbier de Montaut, to produce an illustrated study of Rome's medieval and early modern Christian antiquities, quote unquote. The decade of the 1980s witnessed a series of exhibitions of the Parker Photographic Archive in Rome. And as I came to the school each year and saw a catalog or two of these exhibitions, I was intrigued by the fact, I was interested by the fact that the actual photographers were being discussed and recorded, the photographers which Parker had employed. And all were local Italians, with one significant exception. Charles Smeaton was the anomaly. And in these catalogues, he was always referred to as Il Canadese. Now, you may not be surprised to learn that Canadian aspects of work on early medieval Rome are fairly rare. And prior to the 20th century, I think this reference may well be unique. So it certainly, as another Canadese, it piqued my interest. And I became determined to discover more about Smeaton. And to make that task even more intriguing as well as daunting, when I asked various specialists about on the history of photography in Canada, which there are a number, when I asked them to tell me about Charles Smeaton, they said, "We've never heard of him." Well, that should not have been the case, because Smeaton did, in fact, leave a footprint in Canada. It turns out that the name of Charles Smeaton, and it's the man you're looking at now, his name appears frequently in the pages of a newspaper, the Quebec City Mercury, in the early years of the 1860s. The Smeaton family were immigrants from Scotland in 1842, when Charles was about 3. And his father ran a merchant tailor's shop, as the ads say, at 24 Palace Street. We wouldn't call it that now, I think, would we? We say Rue du Palais, in Quebec City. And on the 13th of August of 1861, we get our first notice, again in the Quebec Mercury, of a second commercial establishment operating from the same street address, Smeaton's Photographic Studio, which offered its clients a wide range of photographic and painted images, and I quote, "from the smallest miniature up to full-length life size." Don't know if anyone who has been to Quebec City will recognize this, but it is a street that does still exist for Louis and others in the room who may know Quebec. It's Rue Saint-Jean in the old town. Now, as yet, I know nothing about Charles Smeaton's training, although presumably he was, well, we know he was also an artist. As a photographer, he was probably largely self-taught. And the Quebec Directory for 1863-64 does list him as both an artist and photographer. And a number of prints with the name Smeaton's Photographers or Smeaton's Photographic Gallery, printed on their back, are preserved in the National Archives of Canada, mainly views of Quebec City, such as the one you see here. There's also one portrait, so he did do portraits, and this is an interesting one. It's of George Mountain, a name not familiar even to many Canadians, but George Mountain was the Anglican Bishop of Quebec from 1837 to 1863. And there's actually in Quebec a small university named after him in Lennoxville, Quebec, called Bishop's University. And they were very pleased when I actually published this photograph because they did not have a picture of Bishop Mountain. So this may be the only one in existence. None of the photographs in the National Archives of Canada bear dates, but Bishop Mountain died on the 6th of January, 1863, and the photograph must predate that, presumably. I don't think this is a post-mortem photograph. So we have some idea of when Smeaton started to get involved in photography. Now, also what I don't know is how exactly this young Canadian photographer in his 20s came to meet John Henry Parker. But Parker himself would later record that it took place in England in the summer of 1866, and it was very likely, I think, to have been in London, where Parker exhibited his Roman photographs every summer. Go back to Smeaton. Now, Parker had become interested in the Roman catacombs because he disagreed with the prevailing opinion that all the painted decorations belonged to the earliest centuries of Christianity. And he had read his Liber Pontificalis, and he noted that many later popes had repaired and done work in the suburban cemeteries, and he concluded that at least some of the murals must be early medieval as opposed to early Christian in date. And as he would later observe in an article published in 1877, entitled Notes on the Dates of the Paintings in the Roman Catacombs, published in the Archaeological Journal, and I quote, The history of art has not always been connected with religious disputes, and the history of painting has never been my study. But the question of the dates of the paintings has interested me from the first season that I was in Rome, when I used to go every Monday morning into one of the catacombs with my friend, Mr. Long. Parker believed that photographs would permit a more accurate assessment than drawings. Reasonable. Parker believed that photographs would facilitate comparisons to paintings and murals in churches above ground, paintings and murals which perhaps were more securely dated, and an entire volume of the archaeology of Rome ended up being devoted to this particular subject, and it's outside. Now, he was certainly correct in wishing to expand the range of dates in which the catacombs were visited and were decorated, and his suggestion that some of the murals, for example, in the catacomb of Comodilla, might be associated with repairs undertaken in the time of Pope John I in the first half of the 6th century, that actually has considerable merit, and there are paintings in Comodilla that we would place today in the decade of the 520s. But his insistence that, and I quote, 3/4 of them are of the 8th or 9th century, end of quote, that is obviously a gross exaggeration, and the dates which you will see published in his catalog of the photographs, those dates are pure fantasy for the most part. So he was on the right track, but he got a lot of it, most of it, really very wrong. But before he could even get that far, he encountered a problem which initially seemed to be insurmountable. Neither Simelli nor any of the other photographers whom he employed could solve the technical problem associated with taking pictures underground in the catacombs, where in a pre-electric age, the only light was provided by portable lamps and by candles. And this illumination was simply wholly insufficient for the lengthy exposures required to produce usable pictures. Smeaton proposed a possible solution: the use of magnesium flare. Now, this was a new technique. Magnesium wire was first produced commercially in Manchester in 1864, and in April 1865 it was used successfully by a Scottish photographer, Charles Smythe, to take the first pictures inside the Egyptian pyramids. How Smeaton learned of the process is not known, but the concept was broadly discussed by photographers in the early 1860s, and like most pioneers in the medium, Smeaton attempted to keep up to date with the latest experiments and technical advances. Nor did he have to travel in order to do so, because already on the 27th of April 1864, the Quebec Mercury had published an account of the advantages of using what it called the new magnesium light for photography. And this article in his home city newspaper claimed, again I'll quote, "At the distance of 8 feet from the sitter, the light produces a negative effect equal to any obtained from sunlight under the most favorable circumstances." And it concluded its account with the prescient observation, "This opens a new page in photography." And indeed, it did. In that same year, 1864, the Montreal-based photographer William Notman began conducting his own experiments with magnesium wire and with other sources of artificial light, and he and Smeaton are known to have been in contact. Following a demonstration of the effectiveness of magnesium wire in taking pictures of medieval mural paintings in Canterbury Cathedral, of all places, Smeaton agreed to accompany Parker to Rome the following winter and it would seem that he spent most of the last year and a bit of his life there. He never did return to Canada, as some of the exhibition catalogues of the 1980s assumed that he had gone back to Canada. No, he did not. He died here in Rome on March 30th of 1868, a few days short of his 30th birthday. And his grave may still be seen and visited in the Protestant cemetery by the pyramid of Gaius Cestius. I'm going to divert just for a second. I'm going to give one of two plugs for a search engine called, you may have heard of, maybe not, but possibly, Google. And they're not paying me, I assure you, unfortunately, but I wish they would. I found Smeaton's grave through Google, because if you enter Charles Smeaton into Google, you come up with an inventory, very, very useful inventory of the Protestant cemetery, the Cimitero Cattolico at Piramide, and there is his name, so it was easy for me to go and to find the tomb. There'll be a second Google plug in a bit. Now, the proposed solution was in fact a good one, and from the 1866-67 season, we get Parker's first photographs taken in the catacombs, numbered 561 to 564 in the catalogue, which adds also the notation, quote, taken with magnesium light. And the site is the catacomb known as the catacomb of the Vigna Orandanini on the south side of the city of the Appia, a cemetery which had been rediscovered only in 1859. The next group of catacomb photos in Parker's catalogue were taken in the catacomb of Pontianus. This is to the west of the city on the hill of Monteverde, and the site of a major pilgrimage shrine in the early Middle Ages, which is described in considerable detail in a 7th century guidebook, the De Locis Sanctis Martyrum. And here we see Parker photograph 611, and you can also see the print in the exhibition. And Smeaton's role as a photographer is recorded in the inscription at the bottom. Indeed, his name would appear thereafter in all but one of the Parker photographs, which we can attribute to Smeaton from 1866-67 and 67-68. Additional catalogue entries list photographs from the catacombs of Priscilla, Parker 612-613, Praetextatus, Parker 614 to 17, Domitilla, Parker 618 to 621, the Coimentarium Maius, Parker 626 to 628, and since we're in Parioli, the Parioli Catacomb Santa Ermete, St. Hermes, Parker 629. And all those are accompanied by the notation taken with magnesium light. Now, apart from their general importance as the earliest known catacomb photographs, one image in particular I shall single out to you as being worthy of very special mention. This is the jeweled cross in the catacomb of Pontianus, Monteverde, now inaccessible due to an accumulation of groundwater, or at least it was when I saw it in the 1980s. Maybe Olaf can tell me if it's been that problem's been solved since. But still fully visible in 1867 when the water reached only the foot of the cross, and it could be photographed. And this Smeaton photograph, which is Parker 609, remains, as far as I know, the only photographic record of this mural, to supplement some drawn copies by Bosio and others. But this is the only photograph that I'm aware of. So my second Google moment. A few years ago, when I was giving a talk on Charles Smeaton in Canada, I got an email from the great-great-grandson of Charles Smeaton's younger brother, John, who said, I see you're interested in my great-great-great-uncle, Charles Smeaton. Would you be interested in looking at a letter which he had written, or a memoir, which he had written and sent back to his family in Canada, in Quebec, describing his photographic excursion into the catacomb of Priscilla in January 1867. And indeed, I was very interested. And the letter, also the photograph of Smeaton, which you have been looking at, these things are preserved today in the Smeaton family archive, and I will present this letter publicly here for the first time. So I'm very pleased to say I've learned recently that the full text will be published in a forthcoming issue of the Revista di Archeologia Cristiana. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is Smeaton's actual handwriting, and I find it interesting that he's edited it as he's gone through. So you can see he seems to have changed his mind about the title, but then gone back to it. So, but you can actually sort of see his mind working as you go through. And I'll read you, a sizable portion, but certainly not all. Having determined to take some photographic pictures in the catacombs, I communicated this intention to a couple of intimate friends, who, on hearing it, expressed a very strong desire to accompany me, and earnestly entreated to be allowed to do so. To this I at once consented, because however much love of my profession and desire to bring to light whatever relics of ancient art might exist amongst the hidden mysteries of those receptacles of the mighty dead might stimulate me to exertion, I felt glad indeed to think that I should have the company and conversation of friends to cheer me in my labors. Accordingly, on an appointed day in January 1867, having hired a carriage in which I deposited my instruments and chemicals, we left Rome by the Porta Salaria. My object for this visit was, in particular, to obtain photographs of the various paintings and sculptures which adorn the walls of the chapel of St Priscilla, and in general to take a picture of anything which might attract my attention. Having left the vehicle, we at once prepared for our descent, the custodian and guide of the catacombs assisting me by carrying the chemicals and other matters, while I took charge of the instruments. It is true we were about to descend into utter darkness, but that consideration did not in the least affect our party, because they knew that, in addition to the usual supply of candles, I carried with me into those dismal dungeons coil upon coil of sunshine in the shape of magnesium wire, and that I would bring to view much that had been hidden from the light of day for centuries past. You can just go to this. This isn't Priscilla, but it's his best catacomb interior photograph, I think, so I'll put that up while I continue. Following our guide, we wound our way through a perfect labyrinth of corridors, on each side of which were the tombs of the early Christian martyrs. Many of the skeletons were lying in situ, some in a state of seemingly perfect preservation, others reduced to an undistinguishable heap in consequence of having been disturbed in some way or other. I particularly observed one skeleton so perfect in all its parts that even the patellae, or kneecaps, remained in their places. But so frail was this apparent firmness, the custodian informed me, that a breath of wind touching the remains too rudely would cause them to crumble into dust. After traveling through those tortuous passages for upwards of half an hour, we at length arrived at the chapel of St Priscilla. This being my principal theater of operations, I proceeded to make my arrangements for taking pictures. Those arrangements, however, occupied a good deal of time. And when I'd completed my first photograph, I found my companions laboring under that restless and uneasy demeanor which so soon betrays the uninterested spectator. Observing this and feeling in my heart that had I been in their place, my mind would in all probability have been in complete unison with theirs, and knowing besides that there was nothing very enchanting in the prospect by which they were surrounded, and that they had nothing to do, I told them that if they would rather ascend to the light of day, they were at perfect liberty to do so, as I by no means wished to detain them against their inclinations, the more especially as it would take me fully 2 hours longer to get up the pictures I intended taking that day. They all left me. I stood still for a few moments under the influence of a strange, indescribable feeling. My eyes strained after them as long as the faint glimmer of the custodian's candle could be seen. My ears drank in the echoes of their receding footsteps, until at last these also sank into dark and dreary silence, and I was alone with the dead. Casting off the incubus which seemed to be hanging over me, I tackled my work with renewed vigor. And mind and body being thus fully employed, the absence of living companionship did not give me a single thought. This was well enough for a time, but having completed all the negatives I intended taking, I commenced packing up my apparatus to be ready for starting when the custodian should return. In the course of this operation, it struck me that surely he might have been back long before, and on looking at my watch, I found that he had been gone for upwards of 2 hours. My work had kept me heedless of the flight of time, but my packing being finished and having nothing else to do, I began wondering what could have kept him so long away. To pass the time, I rambled about here and there, peering first into this tomb, then into that, endeavoring to conjure up pictures of the long past times when the dust which lay before me lived and moved and had its being. Tired of this, my mind took another direction. The idea sprung up that some accident might have befallen the guide, and that he would never return. Then rose before me a long array of the many tales I had read of travelers belated in these dark corridors, starved to death and lost forever to the outer world. My imagination seemed to revel on each incident of these fearful stories, clinging, as it were, with tenfold tenacity to their most revolting and harrowing details, ending in the thought that I, too, might add one more to the awful list of the buried alive. Wandering, as doubtless they had done, round and round the dreadful charnel house, enduring the pangs of thirst and hunger, the blighted visions of fame and ambition, of happiness and home, of madness and despair, and at last the cold, clammy hand of death throwing around me, amid all these horrors, the dark and silent pall of earthly extinction. Under the influence of such thoughts, my ears seemed filled with strange sounds, sounds which defy description, sounds such as I had never heard before, but which seemed born of the grave and the catacomb, until, unable to bear them, all imaginative as I felt they were, I rushed back to the chapel, and sitting down, strove to turn my thoughts to things and circumstances widely different from my present surroundings. It was all in vain. Back would come the stern reality of the position and its dread imaginings. Keenly did I stretch ear and eye to catch sound or sight of the old custodian returning, but no such comfort came. For the first time, too, I thought of my candles, the whole 3 of which I had allowed to burn on unheeded. On examination, I found to my horror that 1 had burned out, while, as I calculated what remained of the other 2, after extinguishing one piece to act as a reserve, would barely last for another half hour. And then total darkness. Having carefully put away the piece of candle I had extinguished, leaving the other burning, I lit my magnesium lamp and again commenced rambling among the corridors, throwing bright gleams of light into the surrounding darkness, just as fancy prompted me. This amusement, however, availed me nothing. The light I threw around, with its shadows flickering and flitting here and there, shimmering restlessly through the nervous vibration of my hand, seemed but to bring to my disordered eye pale and ghastly forms clad in white garments of the grave, wandering about, seeming to wonder at the strange light which, after so many hundreds of years of darkness, was thus illuminating their sepulchres. So real seemed the illusion that the beating of my heart became slow, painful, and labored. A feeling of approaching unconsciousness came creeping slowly over me, and leaning against the wall for support, you may imagine my thoughts when I felt it slowly giving way behind me. The added horror drove back the faintness, and starting up I found I'd been leaning against the marble slab of a tomb, which, loosened by the pressure, fell at my feet on the floor of the corridor, and with it a portion of the bones of its tenant. I staggered back to the chapel, and sitting down, strove to rally my nerves to steadiness and constrain my thoughts to reason. For a time I partially succeeded, and it then struck me that I'd been expending my magnesium light in a very foolish manner, the more especially as the candle I had left burning was smoldering in its socket. So lighting my last piece and extinguishing my lamp, I determined to wait quietly and patiently for the return of the custodian. The intention was a good one, but like many others of a similar description, it was not carried out. Quiet or patient I could not be, so jumping up, I again passed into a chapel next to that in which I'd been working, and scarcely had I taken half a dozen paces when my foot struck against something on the floor. I stooped, put out my hand to feel what it was, and shivered in my very heart with terror inexpressible when I found my fingers in the eye holes of a human skull. Perhaps, I thought, the skull of one who had been left there to perish as I might be. At that moment, a strange noise struck on my ear. I rushed back to the chapel, wild with affright and terror, to find the old custodian making 1,000 apologies for leaving me so long alone. Now I leave you to be the judge, but that 3 hours alone in the catacombs never can or will be effaced from my memory. Well, to a 21st century ear, Smeaton's prose seems more than a little florid, and undoubtedly it was intended very much to be exactly that and to leave a strong impression on his reading audience. But the horror at the thought of being left alone to an eternity of darkness, surrounded by the bodies of the dead, is actually a topos which runs through mentions of the catacombs, actually going back as far as Jerome in the late 4th century, who talks about going on Sundays to visit the cemeteries, of ancestors, but also of early Christian saints and martyrs, and quotes a psalm about going down alive into hell. So this is a theme that runs through catacomb literature. And as we've already seen, Bosio and his companions did run out of candles, or at least so they claimed, and had a difficult time getting out. And I'm sure Smeaton knew that passage, because I think he would have known the Roma Sotterranea. But the same notion also seems to have been particularly prevalent actually in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, an era prone to what Robert Gaston has aptly termed, I think, his phrase is the Gothic taste for pleasurable terror. So in her letter from Italy, published in London in 1776, but recording a visit paid a few years earlier, Lady Anna Miller, for example, expresses her feelings of panic when she thought she had lost her companions in a cemetery. And the artist John Flaxman, some of you will know, who visited Rome the winter of 1787 and 1788, declined to go very far into a catacomb because, as he reported, he was, quote, afraid that the torch might go out. Yeah, a well-founded fear. It's curious, and Robert Gaston is the person who's put all these texts together, but it's curious how the catacombs feature prominently in many 19th century works of fiction in Britain, usually as places to be feared, as places where you got lost and died, but not always. And there was also a sort of counter-movement to emphasize that these were places of sanctity, places where the bones of the martyrs reposed. For example, some of you will know Cardinal Nicholas Wiseman's 1854 historical novel, not one I have read, I'm afraid I must confess, but apparently quite popular at the time, called Fabiola, subtitled The Church of the Catacombs. So the catacombs were certainly known to readers of English, and even if they hadn't visited Rome. I can imagine that Smeaton derived some delight in the thought of frightening his family back home in Quebec, and hence a very careful attempt to convey this sense of terror, which may or may not have actually existed. Just finish with another thought or two. The late 1860s, when Smeaton was taking his pictures and Parker was amassing his catalogs of photographs, it was actually a very interesting time politically to be in Rome. Because not only were there a rash of new archaeological discoveries, San Clemente being an obvious example, but the political situation was, shall we say, interesting. Because it corresponded, of course, to the final push of the Italian Risorgimento and the collapse of the papal state as a political entity on the 20th of September, 1870, when the troops of Vittorio Emanuele broke through at the Porta Pia. Many in Rome in the late 1860s were looking back to the age of early Christianity, the age before the time of the Emperor Constantine, the age of the persecution of the church, and were drawing parallels to their own time. So Risorgimento was seen as being a persecution of the church. And perhaps not surprisingly, artists and patrons of the day looked to the catacombs and to other monuments of early Christianity for inspiration. And I don't think it's actually been studied much, or certainly not to my knowledge, but if you look at work undertaken in Rome in the late 1860s, and including things like new crypts, which are added to the Church of Santi Apostoli, for example, or Santa Francesco Romana, these all employ catacomb motifs from cemeteries recently discovered by De Rossi and others. And I'm sure that is done quite consciously in this milieu. But it also meant that historical research often took on political overtones, whether those were intended or not. And in an article published in the 1870 issue of the Archaeological Journal, Parker reports that De Rossi, who was his contact, had informed him, with regret, he says, that the papal authorities had withdrawn their permission for photography in the catacombs. Parker says De Rossi gave him the reason that this was due to the potential of magnesium light to damage the murals. Well, Parker, in his article, rejects this. The word he uses is, he says, it is moonshine. and claims that this was simply the excuse made to put a stop to his research, at least some of which certainly was intended to challenge the official views, particularly on the dating of catacomb murals. Now, the precise date of that conversation between Parker and de Rossi is not given, but this, along with the death of Charles Smeaton in early 1868, may well explain Parker's apparent lack of attention to the catacombs in the following years. But the advantages of photography in creating a documentary record had been demonstrated very clearly, very definitively, and from that moment on, there's been no turning back. Thank you.